Hello, everyone, and welcome to your module for week one, focusing on chapter one, ethnic diversity and psychology. Ever since the founding of this country, skin color, national origin, and cultural differences have been used to restrict the rights and freedoms of certain groups or have been allowed to shape the nature of our personal interactions. Today, we're going to be talking about what the United States looks like as an ethnically diverse society. We're going to break down a little bit some of the ethnic diversity of the country, and also talk about why it's important to study the psychology of ethnic diversity and how that differs from cross-cultural psychology. Before we get started, it's important to define some basic terms that we'll be using throughout our time together. First is ancestry, which describes a person's origin, heritage, or descent that is associated with their birthplace of self or their ancestor. Next is culture, a set of attitudes, values, beliefs, and norms that are shared within a group and transmitted across generations. Then we have ethnicity, a social group's distinct sense of belongingness as a result of common culture and descent. Nationality describes a person's country of birth or descent. And lastly, race. Race is a socially constructed concept based on prevailing social and political attitudes. Race is often used to express ambiguous distinction, promote dominance of certain privileged groups, and oppress groups that are deemed inferior. All of these mentioned areas of diversity are important because they affect the way that we think and act. The United States is rich in its ethnic and cultural diversity. The mere presence of having these diverse people describes what is called facial diversity. Facial diversity is variations in people's physical characteristics, for example, their skin color, eye shape, hair texture, or their national origin. However, facial diversity in and of itself does not support the existence of a truly multicultural society. What we need to develop a functional multicultural society is a presence of positive interpersonal relationships among diverse individuals and the sharing of power and resources, as well as mutual collaboration and dialogue. When it comes to multiculturalism, there are four kind of basic tenets that are required for this to be effective. So first, it requires a respectful concern and interest in the lived experiences of diverse groups of people. In essence, stepping into another person's shoes and understanding how he or she experiences and views the world. This is only possible when we look into a group's psychosocial experience and when we learn to appreciate and respect what makes us different and unique. Multiculturalism also requires a personal commitment to critically evaluate one's own privilege or preferential standing in the world, as well as to evaluate one's own cultural biases and stereotypes. Lastly, it rests on this fundamental belief in the common good and a willingness to contribute to it. Now, when we look at the ethnic diversity of the United States, your book references the United States Census from the year 2000. This census was pretty historic because it actually allowed for people to consider themselves as belonging to more than one racial group. First, I want to talk a little bit about just the ethnic background. So it included ancestries from African American, American Indian, Arab to Cuban, German, Irish, Japanese, Korean, Norwegian, Polish, Russian, Scottish, Irish, Vietnamese, and Welsh. And you can see some of the figures there on the screen. Now, the ethnic groups that we'll be focusing on in this course are African Americans or Blacks, so people that have origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa. We'll also be looking at American Indians or Alaskan Natives. So these are people who have origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, and who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. We'll be looking at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, also known as AAPI in some of the more recent literature. These are people that have origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or on the Indian subcontinent. And lastly, we'll be looking at Hispanics or Latinos. So this would describe a person of Cuban, Mexican, Puerto Rican, South or Central American, or any other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of their race. It is important for us to remember that the labels used in the census reports, so like Hispanics or Asian Americans, are labels that we use out of convenience. They actually tend to hide pretty important within group differences. These differences among the members of a particular group are the product of variations in origin, socioeconomic status, educational level, employment, and many other variables that just affect people's behavior in general. So, for example, it's really possible to see how Asian Americans, as a global term, differ in terms of ancestry and just experience of the world if some trace their ancestry to Japan compared to others who trace their ancestry to Vietnam or Cambodia or the Philippines. This heterogeneity or diversity in ancestry is a pretty significant variable that produces within group variability. The reason that we need to attend to this, because when we talk about within group heterogeneity or things that make things or differences, it's the need to analyze this information. We have to break down the groups in terms of importance or relevant variables or characteristics. This process is called disaggregation. It allows researchers to better understand characteristics of any given group. So sometimes when considering a group of Asian Americans of various national backgrounds, sometimes we can get a lot of information out of that. However, it's often more important to differentiate groups that are subsumed in these larger categories. For example, huge disparities exist in educational attainment, health status, and employment between Chinese and Japanese Americans. However, if we were to label these groups of people generally, we would just label them as Asian Americans. It's very important, disaggregation is very important to help us better understand characteristics of an ethnic group. However, it's difficult to carry out because it's really hard to gather enough representative samples of people from one national heritage. So this lack of appropriate disaggregation by national origin is probably one of the most significant limitations of research on ethnic groups in the United States. Now, it's also really important to consider the role of dual or multiple ethnicities when studying minority ethnic groups in the United States. Now, as I mentioned before, in the 2000 census, this was the first time that respondents were able to indicate if they identified with more than one race. Turns out, about 6.8 million people in the United States describe themselves as multiracial. 39.9% of American Indians and Alaska Natives reported being of multiple races. 13.9% of Asian Americans and 4.8% of African Americans. Additionally, a pretty significant finding of the census is the fact that a large proportion of children under the age of 18 reported belonging to two or more races. In particular, 7.7% of Latinos under the age of 18 reported belonging to two or more races, compared to 3.2% of those who were not Hispanic or Latino. Other areas of diversity among ethnic groups that we should attend to are language proficiency, educational attainment, and socioeconomic status and the impact of poverty. Language proficiency. Regarding this, the census indicated that 18% of people ages 5 years and older spoke a language other than English at home. More common languages spoken were Spanish, Chinese, French, German, Tagalog, and Italian. Now, historically, the United States has been improving the level of educational attainment of its population by supporting compulsory education in primary and secondary schooling and helping to finance college education. The 2000 census reported that 80.4% of individuals aged 25 years or older had at least finished high school. However, it's really important to note that there's a great diversity in educational attainment across ethnic groups. Asian Americans show the highest level of attainment in terms of achieving at least a bachelor's degree, as well as an advanced degree. However, Latinos show the lowest percentages in educational achievement across the board. Therefore, educational attainment is very important and may be relevant to disaggregate in research being conducted among ethnic minority groups. When it comes to socioeconomic status and poverty, poverty rates have been declining over the years, even though members of minority ethnic groups continue to exhibit higher rates of poverty than whites. In fact, overall, the poverty rate of foreign-born individuals is higher, so 16.1% than that of native-born, 11.1%. While naturalized foreign-born citizens show a lower poverty rate of 9.9%. Something else to keep in mind is that a significant number of ethnic minority households are multifamily or multi-generational in nature, which influences average household figures. So why is it important that we study the psychology of ethnic diversity? Well, there are three main reasons. First, it helps us provide a context for understanding the population that we're studying. Psychological theory, research, and interventions need to be located in the sociocultural context where individuals and communities reside. So, if we so we need to really attend to the context of where these people live. Secondly, it helps us to improve the validity of psychology. Ignoring culture can often lead to inappropriate methodology and false data and conclusion. Lastly, it helps advance culturally diverse societies. So psychologists can increase our understanding of cultures and promote individual growth in ethnically diverse environments. Helps us also move away from this Eurocentric bias, which is this overemphasis given by some individuals to the experiences and characteristics of white individuals who can trace their ancestry to Europe. This also can help us get away from this idea that characteristics of white individuals are considered normal or ideal. When we think about just research in general, so we typically rely on college students to fill out surveys and to answer questions about the general population. However, this over-reliance on white college students in particular in psychological research and the lack of non-white researchers have influenced and produced this Eurocentric science that actually has limited generalizability or applicability when individuals from other ethnic groups are considered. So one important difference that I would like us to understand before getting further in the course is how ethnic psychology is different from cross-cultural psychology. Both areas are concerned with the effects of culture and cultural differences on people's behavior, but they differ in terms of their cultural or geographic area of emphasis. So cross-cultural psychology emphasizes differences in cultural influences across nations or regions of the world. So think of it more as like intercontinental, versus ethnic psychology focuses on ethnic and cultural group differences within a single nation or community. Another difference between these is the recognition that is given to the role played by differences in cultural learning on an individual's beliefs, values, attitudes, and behaviors. Research in ethnic psychology considers how acculturation affects people's behavior, if not directly, but at least indirectly. Additionally, with ethnic psychology, Ethnic psychologists recognize the significance of certain social conditions that affect the attitudes and behaviors of ethnic groups in general. What's really exciting about this is that the importance of ethnic psychology has been reflected in the field. And with that, we've seen a lot of growth take place over the years. So, for example, there are a greater number of ethnic psychology publications. So, we have books and also journals that have become well cited and well utilized in the research. Additionally, APA in 2002 issued the series of guidelines for training and for the professional practice of psychologists. These principles respond to this need for psychologists to be both knowledgeable and proficient in understanding the various members of ethnic groups and to be culturally competent in their professional practice, whether they are teaching, conducting research, or applying psychological knowledge. They're pretty broad, but they're based on the belief that as social beings, we all have attitudes and expectancies that impact how we treat other individuals, particularly those who are different from ourselves. Further, the guidelines help support the notion that most psychological research may actually be pretty limited in its usefulness and appropriateness by the monocultural perspectives of researchers and the lack of diversity in subject pools, research teams, and peer reviewers. So these guidelines hope to reflect the continuing evolution of the studies of psychology, changes in society at large, and emerging data about the different needs that particular individuals and groups, especially those historically marginalized or disenfranchised within and by psychology, based on their ethnic or racial heritage and social group identity or membership. The growth of ethnic psychology also supports the exploration of ethnic identity and culture among all groups, not just Black and brown people, including those that are often considered as white. So it's expanded on this study of whiteness, recognizing that individuals whose skin color is light, also known as white, share experiences and attitudes that differentiate them from others whose skin color is darker.